Final Fantasy XIII. Welcome back to this year of Final Fantasy and the first of this Lightning Saga, Lightning Trilogy if you want to call it that. We're here with the initial game that started it all, Final Fantasy XIII. And normally this would be the final episode of the month, but I feel that the trilogy of the Lightning Saga as a whole needs to be discussed sequentially. So games Final Fantasy IV and X, where the sequels were far different in style and tone from the original game, yeah, we need to take these game by game. So Final Fantasy XIII was the flagship title of the Fabula Nova Crystallis project and more blatantly features the mythology compared to the other games in my opinion. The initial release was on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It was released on December 17th, 2009 for Japan in the PlayStation 3, March 9th, 2010 for the Western audience as a whole, and May 27th for the rest of Asia on the PlayStation 3. Similarly for the 360, except one interesting note here is that it came out an entire year, minus 1 day, later in Japan on December 16th of 2010 for the Xbox 360. Finally, worldwide, it did release on Steam or the Windows platform on October 9th with a relatively poor quality port, sad to say, but if you want to play it on PC, you can, but good luck with that. Final Fantasy XIII was really the first step in this new direction we've seen Final Fantasy move towards. Initially, whenever I think of new Final Fantasy, I think of Advent Children, that Final Fantasy VII movie, kind of marking that very, very distinct divide here. All the combat and the ways that battle and things like that were handled definitely feels more like a Final Fantasy Advent Children type of combat setup. The director here was Motomu Toriyama, producer was Yoshinori Kitase, who should be familiar, artist was Isamu Kamikokuryo, sorry if I said that wrong, I completely think that I did, and the composer was Masashi Hamazu, and you can instantly see that while some names may be familiar, for instance Kitase's name, we no longer have the Sakaguchi, the Amano, the Nobu Uematsu anywhere to be seen here. It's a wholly different direction for the series, and most fans agree that it doesn't really retain the feeling of a traditional Final Fantasy. Now, while I don't necessarily agree entirely, it's clear that most of the classic feelings of Final Fantasy are just not really present or dramatically changed. It's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing. Here, there's a lot to say about Final Fantasy XIII, and I guess we should just go ahead and get the main point out of the way right now. Until Final Fantasy XV came out, and even so, with that out, Final Fantasy XIII was pretty blatantly, and still is, the black sheep of the series, and debatably, even after 15 came out, it still is. While subsequent games like Final Fantasy 15 have both fans that adore it and fans that hate it, the general consensus that I've seen on the internet and pretty much anyone that I talk to is that very few people actually do enjoy Final Fantasy 13. Myself, well, I'll get into my particular feelings at the end of this video. Suffice it to say, I actually don't hate the game, but I'll go into more detail later. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of the game first and the battle system. Generally speaking, the game functions like a traditional Final Fantasy would, at least at first glance. Here you're going to begin with your main character, Lightning, and as you progress through the story, you're going to meet other main characters who pull together for specific reasons and go on their adventure, just like any, other Final Fantasy. Battles are a huge point of differentiation here, though. So while we still have the standard 3-party system, there's quite a bit here that's jarring to older fans. Strangely, the first thing coming off of Final Fantasy XII is that combat has largely gone back to a traditional random battle system that we see in pretty much all the classic Final Fantasies that you would think of. However, the change here comes from the control of battles. While initially it looks as if it's taken a step back to, say, Final Fantasy 7 or 8, here you only control your party's leader's actions, and that's usually Lightning. But you can switch to whoever you want out of combat. However, even that has a caveat, as you aren't really controlling your character by selecting actions for them. Now, actually, I want to say that yes, you certainly can do that, but by and large, throughout most of the game, you can auto-select the commands, and the game will select the best actions given on your situation, especially if you've, say, done Libra on an enemy and seen its weaknesses and everything. Auto commands will go and take full advantage of that. Here's where people begin to come into conflict with the system at hand. Much of the time you'll hear people say that this game is press X to win, or something along those lines. I disagree. It could not be further from the truth, actually, and let me explain why. Coming from my own experiences with Final Fantasy fans and their disdain for this game, I found that they, by and large, don't understand what the battle system is actually trying to accomplish here. So let me explain. Older Final Fantasy games were a micromanagement game. You picked every character's action in battle, and clearly in this game you don't. But that doesn't mean that it's dumbed down in any way. Instead, here in Final Fantasy XIII, you're actually watching over this kind of macro battle strategy. It's not more about the particular commands that you give, it's about relating and countering the situation that you find yourself in in the battles. So, and it's a constantly changing situation. Here, well, okay, if you don't get to pick what you do in combat, then, what is it? Like, what am I even talking about? Well, individual actions are largely left to AI, but you can effectively change your character's what they consider jobs here on the fly at any point in time. Here the name of the battle system comes into effect. No longer do we have the active time battle system, the ATB. This is actually called the Command Synergy battle system, and it operates in much of the same way that ATB does, except you get to assign multiple job setups to your characters all together, and those are known as paradigms. So if you need a more defensive strategy, you basically do this what they call paradigm shift of jobs, and your characters will change that particular role. And the key here is that it takes no time at all to do that. You can do it whenever you want, regardless of wherever that ATB, that time bar is on, selecting the commands. This is vital. I'll go so far as to say, as you're actually more involved in combat in this game than you are in any of the other Final Fantasy games. I would absolutely love for somebody to just repeatedly press X and nothing else and see how far they actually get in this game. I can tell you right now, it's not going to be very far. The jobs here in this game are also not necessarily familiar jobs that we know, such as Warrior, Black Mage, White Mage, etc. Here we have a completely new selection of jobs or roles in the form of the Commando, which is like a warrior, the Ravager, which is like an offensive caster, Black Mage, something like that, a Sentinel, who's a defender, kind of like a paladin, I guess, a Saboteur, which is a support caster. If you wanted to relate them to maybe something like a Time Mage, they do debuffs, you could do that. We have a Synergist, who's actually also a support caster that enhances your party, kind of, gives you more HP or particular elemental defenses or whatever have you. And then of course the last one, we have a medic, who is like your leader, your white mage, whatever. Different characters gain roles at different times throughout the game, and each set of 3 characters gives you a different paradigm to shift to. It's certainly different from other Final Fantasy games, but it's a great battle system in my opinion, especially whenever you understand what they're going for. If you have preconceived notions of this being a Final Fantasy and playing like a Final Fantasy game that you want, you are going to be disappointed here because it's completely different, but again, different doesn't mean bad. Talking about leveling and progression here, it's something that I actually really enjoy. For much of the game, you actually cap out at gaining particular strengths or advantages or whatever you want to call them, so you can't really out-level anything in the majority of the main storyline and just completely fight through it, essentially. This kind of level cap requires you to be engaged with the game all the time. Of course, if you enjoy over-leveling, you aren't going to like this. That's just simple as that. But I play games to be challenged personally, and this game does have a nice challenge to it. Some battles are pretty hard, but overall it's not a very overly hard game, but it is challenging. And the way that your characters level here is called the Crystarium, which is indeed where I got the channel name. Well, actually, take that back, it's really more from Type 0. Regardless, the Crystarium is used as a place of gaining knowledge in this particular Fabula Nova Crystallis mythos. Perhaps picking a name so connected to Final Fantasy XIII wasn't the best choice for a YouTube channel, but it is what it is now, and I still love it. The Crystarium itself functions similarly to the sphere system of Final Fantasy X, except it's a little bit more linear, only taking short branches to gain other abilities. However, each job or role here has its own Crystarium, and you can, level those up. It's not just one huge overarching board. But you gain AP, which are ability points through battle, and then you use those to advance in whatever role Crystarium that you want to advance in. Again, you're going to advance and top out all these roles fairly easily throughout the game, except near the end whenever you get every role available to everyone, and then it actually becomes much more of a traditional Final Fantasy leveling experience that you would expect. I guess lastly would be to mention the summons here. The game isn't super summon heavy as far as like narrative and storylines goes, but summons do play an important role in terms of who uses them and how they use them. Here there are only 6 summons available, and that's because each main character gets their own summon and that's it. It's a way to fulfill their quest as a lessee, and they manifest these particular summon powers at particular times in their journey. The summons are cool and they morph into different aspects, so while you will get your flashy, like your Bahamut Mega Flares and stuff like that, there are ways to play with the summons that will allow you a little bit more control over them, and it's just something a little bit different. And it's enjoyable to, go and wreck enemies as Bahamut for a little while. Or whatever summon you have, Shiva, and, pick your summon basically. Combat mechanics in Final Fantasy XIII, like I said, are very different despite the game looking like a traditional game, but I have grown to love this combat system and the engagement that it demands. Again, it's simply a macro management system versus a micromanagement system. In my view, neither one is better than the other, and if you buy into that, if you buy into looking at something new for Final Fantasy, which we've gotten quite a bit from Final Fantasy XI to 12 here at 13, you're going to be pleasantly surprised whenever you know what they're going for. So let's move on to the characters though, and this is where the important points of contention comes from the fanbase. Some people really despise these characters, and as for this, it's purely subjective, and there's not a lot to defend or explain. If you don't like him, you don't like him. Narratives are, largely left up to taste, and while I personally enjoy them, I know that many don't, and that's totally cool. Final Fantasy XIII just probably isn't your game then. Let's go over main characters here, because, we have to. It's your Final Fantasy. First, let's get the most well-known Final Fantasy character right outside of Cloud, and that is Lightning, the first de facto female main character. Of course, you can make an argument that Terra from Final Fantasy VI is also the main character there, but either way, it's no mystery here. Lightning is the main character of this game, and obviously it's referred to as the Lightning Saga with Final Fantasy XIII, 13-2, and Lightning Returns. Lightning's very straightforward, kind of off-putting at first, and she's solely focused on her goals. In this case, it's to save her sister Sarah. Of course, going throughout the game, you experience story arcs. She grows as a character, becoming more emotionally available. In many ways, it's no secret that Lightning was created to be sort of a female Cloud. Final Fantasy VII is still super popular, and people like Cloud. So, as Cloud was and still is essentially the most popular character in Final Fantasy, they tried to capitalize on that. And honestly, I think this is where most people have issues, as no character from a Final Fantasy game has really been such a blatant copy of another character. As far as general emotions, I guess. Now, the story of Cloud and the story of Lightning is different, but both are from a militaristic type of background. Lightning uses a gunblade, which you could attribute to Squall, but this time it is a legitimate, real gunblade that actually fires bullets. Again, similar to other characters. Me, personally, I have issues with Lightning and the use of her outside of the trilogy, and I'm looking at you, Louis Vuitton. Yeah, that's bad. Anyway, but honestly, she's one of, if not my favorite main protagonist of the series. And that being said, most of the protagonists aren't really my favorite characters in general from the Final Fantasy franchise, at least main protagonists. But if we're talking leading main characters, and honestly, Lightning is probably my favorite, maybe right next to Cecil from Final Fantasy IV. I'm not overly infatuated with her, like waifu nonsense or any of that, but I just enjoy her character. I don't know what to tell you. I'm one of the few, it seems, but hey, it's just a fact. So Lightning, though, is pushed quite hard in many other Final Fantasy games. I can see people that never really cared for her one way or the other being more and more annoyed because she does get a lot of the spotlight as these newer Final Fantasy games have come out, especially when a majority of Final Fantasy fans don't really enjoy the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. I'm sure it can get incredibly grating on people, seeing Lightning pop up as often as she does. But anyway, alright, enough of Lightning, let's move on to Snow, debatably the other main protagonist. Snow is a leader of the resistance group known as Nora, fighting for people subjugated in what is known as the Purge, which I'll get to in a little bit whenever we talk about the story. Snow seems quite arrogant and he's self-assured at the beginning, but of course things happen for reasons, and he slowly gets knocked down a few pegs, and whenever said reasons reveal themselves, he definitely goes through some heavy character transformation, which is good. It's good stuff. Next, we can talk about Zaz, who's kind of swept up in this overarching grand story and honestly doesn't really have a lot in stake with the main story as the other characters do, but he does have his motivations, let's make that clear, and is generally an okay character. I like Zaz just as much as anyone else. He doesn't really leave much of an impact if I'm going to be honest. Zaz, however, does have the distinction of being my first real WTF moment in Final Fantasy. No spoilers, of course, but immediately, whenever you meet him, you learn that his afro houses a chocobo chick, or more properly, if you watched our chocobo videos, they're called chicobos, in his hair. My first thought was, how does he not have bird shit all over his hair like Radagast does in The Hobbit? Still perplexes me today, but hey, he's a super memorable character, I guess, for housing a chocobo chick in his hair. Next, we have Hope, who plays a vital role, especially in relation of Snow, because of said reasons. And he has some effects on Lightning as well, causing her to be more emotionally available. We'll just say that. Even though early in the game, I don't really want to spoil the way that Hope gets caught up in the major story, so that's all I can say about him really in a story form. However, in general, Hope seems to pop up as the most annoying character. People hate Hope for whatever reason. I guess I can see how maybe it would happen given his situation, but I honestly think that all of his actions are justified and he goes and he grows as a character, but I don't know, maybe that's just me. So after Hope, we have Vanille. Vanille is the de facto waifu of the series. For those that don't know what waifu is, don't worry about it. But Vanille really does drive the story and is basically the primary narrator of the game for most of the time, from what I remember, and I've recently played the game. So you'll instantly notice something is strange about Vanille, and also with the next character I'm going to talk about. It's not just your imagination playing with you. She is very much different than the other characters that you meet, but I digress there. I'll let you figure it out for yourself if you haven't played the game. Vanille is your happy-go-lucky character despite some pretty heavy plot burden that she's carrying around. It actually does just occur to me right now as I'm writing this that Vanille and Yuna have a lot in common in the way that they handle themselves in front of other people and personally. So it's, I don't know, it's weird. I've actually never thought of that until just now. It's kind of crazy. Last main character I want to talk about here is Feng, and Feng is easily my favorite character of the game. She too has the strangeness that I associated with Vanille, and I really don't want to say any more than that for sake of narrative. Generally, Feng is wrapped in so much mystery given your first encounter with her. It's really interesting to see how she plays into the major arcs of the game. And Feng is also easily identified by her weapon, which is a spear, and the game's Dragoon, as it were, if we were going to have classic Final Fantasy jobs. Feng is awesome, and you can probably guess what Feng's summon is. So normally, right now, I'd talk about the major villain of the Final Fantasy game, but I did skip that in Final Fantasy XII because I didn't really want to, spoil anything. But here, I'm going to have to skip it as well, because it's not necessarily for that main reason of spoiling anything, but there's not necessarily a main villain. If you take into account the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythology, the term villain just doesn't really hold weight here. Villain, to me anyway, implies this kind of black and white morality, which again is one reason why I didn't do it back in Final Fantasy XII, but you just don't have a real big villain here. As much as I'd love to elaborate, the only way to really understand this is to play the game, honestly. But, that being said, finally, I'll talk about the opening of the narrative a little bit to kind of let you know what you can expect whenever you turn on the game. On the broadest scope, there are two worlds here. Cocoon, which is where all the people live, and Pulse, which is kind of like a hell, I guess. Cocoon looks like the Traveler from Destiny, if you're familiar with that game series, or for those not familiar, it's just a big, giant white sphere hanging in the sky above the actual world known as, like I said, Pulse or Grand Pulse. You begin on a train, Final Fantasy, in Cocoon, and that is headed with several people to commence with what is known as the Purge. The Purge is people that have had contact with a rogue fal'Cie. Now, if you don't remember what a fal'Cie is, it's essentially like a godlike creature, and fal'Cie bestow missions onto people, and those people in turn become what they call a l'Cie. Check out our Fabula Nova Crystallis video to get more of the lowdown there. But anyway, some people have come into contact with this fal'Cie, and now the people in Cocoon want to rid all of these people that, have come into contact with it because they're l'Cie, and l'Cie are bad, and etc., etc., etc. So they get sent down to Pulse. Pulse, like I said, is basically hell to the populace of Cocoon, but honestly, nobody's really seen Pulse, so take that as you will. The easiest way to imagine this would be basically Nazis rounding up Jews for extermination. Anyway, Lightning finds herself on this train because of reasons, and the story begins. So that's Final Fantasy XIII in a nutshell, but before I end this video, I do want to take some time to reflect on the game and my experiences with it, and maybe the Final Fantasy community as a whole. So Final Fantasy XIII's biggest claim to fame is that it is a hallway simulator, being that it is incredibly linear for much of the game. I completely understand this gripe, and I've actually made it myself. However, the game does open up near the end, similarly to, literally every single Final Fantasy game ever, except for Final Fantasy XV. It is more pronounced here, I'll give you that, and it hasn't done anything to mask that fact. The game is incredibly similar to Final Fantasy X in this way, but X did a lot better in masking its linearity quite well. Much of this was due to some slight side quests that you could, detour and waste some time on. That being said, 13 doesn't have time to use those side quests, even if it did have some, because of the narrative, and this leads us to a huge attack on the game, which is the lack of traditional towns. And I'll be honest, whenever I first played the game, I was in that camp completely, and in fact it does suck. However, if you take a step back and look at the story and the narrative, take that into account, it would undermine that narrative for much of the game. As much of the game, your characters are on the run. They are always being chased. There's no time to screw around in a town while they're being chased, basically, in Cocoon. Things happen later on in the game, this does ease up quite a bit, and then you get your, open world kind of thing. But here, it serves the narrative, it serves the story, and if you had that, it would take away from the urgency of the characters. Now, if you don't ascribe to that narrative, and generally don't like that kind of story, then obviously you won't like the game, which is fine. It does have sense whenever you put that into context of what you're playing and how you're going through the game. One of the most objectively bad things about the game, from a narrative perspective, is the way that information is doled out to you. Much of the mythology at the Fabula Nova Crystallis is relegated to little snippets explainer information that you're going to have to go and read in the menu screen. It's a terrible way of conveying information to a player. This is what I think is the absolute worst thing about the game, myself. There's not a lot to be said in its defense, but there is one argument I guess you could make. That would be that the fact of not putting that information in the narrative to have people speak and tell that to you would make the world more lifelike, because instead of having to explain what, something like Final Fantasy X did in some ham-fisted way, like, oh, what are summoners? There was a reason for that, and that was because Tidus wasn't a real native to that particular world. But here, everyone is native to the world, so they wouldn't really need to say out loud what these particular things were, because the people would know that kind of stuff in the world, having lived just regularly in it in their entire lives. So if that's one way you want to explain that, that's fine, but still, it doesn't really negate the fact that if you want to know everything about the game, have to go in the menu and just talk about it. The last thing I'll say here to wrap things up is that I will admit 100% that I hated this game when I initially started playing it. Absolutely hated it, like most of the Final Fantasy community now. It wasn't what I was expecting at all, completely. And again, I know for the fact that the Final Fantasy community just feels the same. However, this is important. It's probably the most important part of the video. I recently started going back through the game after 7 or so years after I initially beat it, and now that I know what I'm in for without having any preconceived expectations, I've actually been enjoying the hell out of the game. I highly recommend giving it a second chance, and if you're willing to take the game for what it is, not what you want it to be, you may enjoy it as well. So that's it for this video and the first part of this Lightning Saga trilogy. There's a ton to say about this game for sure, and if you didn't or don't like it, I totally get it. Don't play the game. It's fine. You don't have to like everything. Hopefully, though, I've at least given a little bit of illumination on some of the perceived problems of the game and given it context into why it actually does work. Next time, we're going to be talking about the super divisive Final Fantasy XIII 2. I cannot wait to talk about this game because, here's a little spoiler, it is my favorite game of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era. As much as I hated Final Fantasy XIII, XIII 2 did everything that I could have ever wanted in a Final Fantasy game, and I'll talk a lot about that next time. But as always, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.